My brother raised his glass at her cousin's wedding and smirked. She's been gone 5 years. Bet she still hasn't made anything of herself. The room laughed right along. I stayed quiet. Then he leaned in and whispered, "You never belonged in this family." I just clicked my key fob. My car lit up across the lot. "Really?" I said. But he didn't know that night was only the beginning. My name is Mallory Reed, and I was 30 years old when my brother decided to remind an entire wedding reception that in his mind I had never really been family. It happened halfway through my cousin's reception, right in that dangerous stretch of the night when the champagne had softened people's judgment and made savagery sound like entertainment. He lifted his glass with the easy confidence of someone who had spent his whole life believing a room would bend toward him if he smiled first. The smile came before the insult, which somehow made it worse. He joked that I had been gone 5 years and probably still had not made anything of myself. A few people laughed immediately. A few more joined because that is what people do in families like mine. They do not always agree with the meanest person in the room, but they know how to survive him, and sometimes survival looks a lot like laughter. I kept my face still and my shoulders relaxed. I did not glance around to see who had laughed and who had not. I did not give him the satisfaction of seeing where the words landed. That should have been enough for him, but it never is with people who have mistaken domination for personality. When he sat back down, he leaned toward me just far enough so nobody else could hear and said the part he had probably believed for years. He told me I had never belonged in this family. It was the kind of sentence that only works if the person hearing it is still waiting for permission to exist. 5 years earlier, it would have shattered me. That night, it only made something inside me go very calm. I reached into my clutch, found my keys without looking, and pressed the fob. Across the lot, my black Porsche lit up in the dark like a precise answer to a sloppy accusation. The lights flashed clean through the reception hall windows. The mirrors unfolded. The interior glow came alive. I turned back to him and said, "Really?" The look on his face was almost worth a drive. Almost. Because what he did not understand yet was that the car was the smallest and least interesting part of what I'd built while they were all busy writing me off. And what happened after that was the real reason my brother stopped smiling. Before I tell you what happened next, tell me where you're listening from and what the weather is like there. I just want to know how far my story can travel. I'd always been easy for my family to misread because I was never loud about what I wanted. I was not the child who announced plans at dinner or turned ordinary ambition into performance. I was the one who watched, learned, absorbed, and then disappeared into work without asking anyone to clap for me. In families like mine, that kind of personality gets mistaken for fragility. If you are quiet, they assume you are unsure. If you are creative, they assume you are unrealistic. If you are sensitive, they assume you are weak. By the time I was 25, I had already been assigned a role I never agreed to play. I was the gifted but impractical daughter, the one with ideas instead of direction. The one people described with a tilted smile and a careful tone, as if my life were a temporary condition that would either become respectable or collapse on schedule. My degree was in visual design, which sounded decorative to relatives who only respected careers they could summarize in one sentence. I was working event setup jobs before dawn, loading equipment through hotel service entrances, fixing signage, untangling cords, and solving last-minute disasters that people in formal wear never noticed. On weekends, I bartended weddings, corporate banquets, and fundraisers, carrying trays past tables full of people who had no idea how much technical work it took to make an evening feel effortless. I loved parts of it more than I admitted. I loved watching a blank room transform. I loved seeing light change scale and emotion. I loved how design could alter the way people moved, gathered, remembered. But in my family, loving your work was never enough if the work did not sound impressive at Thanksgiving. My brother was the opposite of me in every way that impressed people who preferred simple stories. He had the polished job title, the tailored jackets, the easy handshake, and the practiced way of talking about responsibility as if he had invented the concept. My parents never openly said he was the favorite, but preference has 1,000 small dialects. It lives in who gets defended, who gets explained, who gets time to mature, and who gets evaluated in real time. He was allowed complexity. I was reduced to a pattern. At family gatherings, he liked to make me into a joke so subtly that outsiders would have called it teasing. He would ask if I was still playing with logos and party lights, tell people I worked in decoration if he wanted to make my job sound frivolous, or mention my unpaid invoices like he was describing an amusing flaw in my personality. The problem with that kind of humiliation is not only the savagery, it is the rhythm. Once a family learns to laugh on cue, the savagery stops looking like an event and starts looking like culture. The night I finally left happened at a Labor Day cookout 5 years before the wedding. I had spent the day doing the same things I always did, carrying extra chairs, refilling ice, cleaning in the background, helping in ways that made me useful without making me important. By late afternoon, people were drinking on the patio while my brother held court near the grill, talking about market trends, investment timing, and what he called real adulthood. Then he turned toward me in front of everyone and said, "Some people just are not built for responsibility." He did not raise his voice. He did not have to. My father stared into his drink. My mother adjusted napkins that did not need adjusting. Nobody interrupted. That was the moment something in me finally snapped cleanly instead of painfully. I went home that night, packed 2 suitcases, and moved into a 1-bedroom apartment above a dry cleaner with a radiator that clanged against the wall all winter and a bathroom door that never fully shut. It smelled faintly like starch and hot metal all the time. I worked every job I could get. I bartended for people who spent more on centerpieces than I spent on rent. I stayed after shifts to watch production crews program LED walls and troubleshoot projection systems because I wanted to understand how atmosphere was built. At night, I taught myself motion graphics, event rendering, 3D space mapping, projection design, and pre-visualization software through free tutorials, trial licenses, borrowed login, and the kind of exhausted focus that makes time disappear. I took underpaid jobs first, then low-level contracts, then bigger ones no one would have trusted me with a year earlier. I got stiffed by clients. I carried road cases with bruised hands. I once cried in a supply closet for exactly 4 minutes, washed my face, and went back to work because the ballroom reveal was in 40 minutes, and nothing about my feelings was allowed to delay a show. Over time, my work sharpened. Venues started referring me. Planners stopped treating me like an assistant and started asking for me by name. Then hotel groups started calling. Then luxury brands. Then the scale changed so gradually I almost missed it. I hired my first employee because I had too much work to handle alone. Then a second. Then a small team. Then I signed a lease on a studio space with white walls, polished concrete floors, and enough room to build mock-ups at full scale. Danica came into my life as a freelance operations consultant and stayed because she was one of the rare people who could understand both the business and the pressure without romanticizing either. She helped turn my instincts into systems. She helped build the company that eventually became the thing no one in my family could have imagined. Because none of them had bothered to ask what I was doing while I was gone. To them I had disappeared. In reality, I had been learning how to build something permanent without their permission. And when the invitation to my cousin's wedding arrived in a cream envelope with my name written carefully across the front, I should have known the past was not done trying to collect on the version of me it had left behind. I almost did not go to the wedding. My cousin had always been one of the few people in the family who treated me like a full person instead of a role with a flaw attached to it. So when she called, instead of mailing the invitation, I listened. She sounded happy, nervous, tired, and a little too careful, which told me more than her words did. She said she would love to have me there and that it would mean a lot if I came. She did not mention my brother once. Somehow that omission said everything. I told her yes before I could overthink it. Then spent the next 3 weeks regretting the decision. Danica was the one who refused to let me back out. She said if I could pitch a 7-figure installation to a room full of hospitality executives, I could survive one evening with people whose emotional depth stopped at passive aggression and selective memory. She came with me partly because she was my COO and partly because she was my friend, but mostly because she knew the difference between support and interference. She would be there if I needed an anchor and silent if I needed distance. The venue was exactly the kind of place my family loves, polished enough to signal money, tasteful enough to deny trying too hard. It sat on rolling vineyard land with white floral arrangements, warm lanterns, string music during the ceremony, and staff who could refill a champagne glass without interrupting a conversation. Everything looked beautiful in that edited, expensive way that makes people feel generous about themselves. I arrived in a fitted dark dress, minimal jewelry, hair pulled back, makeup clean and understated. I did not want to look flashy. I wanted to look composed. Families like mine can process failure. Failure comforts them because it confirms their hierarchy. What unsettles them is ambiguity. If you come back polished but unreadable, they do not know where to place you. The first half hour felt like walking through a museum of old assumptions under better lighting. Every conversation had the same shape. Where have you been all this time? Are you still doing design? Is that enough to live on now? You look well. You seem busy. Some relatives were genuinely curious. Others were taking inventory. I answered politely and revealed almost nothing. I had learned over the years that information is not always neutral inside families. Sometimes it becomes material. My mother hugged me too long, which might have felt tender if guilt had not been standing right behind it. My father shook my hand like we were neighbors closing a sale. An aunt told me she always knew I would land on my feet, which is what people say when they want credit for hope. They never actually offered. Danica stayed near enough to rescue me from invasive conversations, but far enough away that people would not read her as protection. Then my brother arrived at the edge of my vision with his wife beside him, and that familiar expression that always made him look as if he had already judged the room and won. He greeted me warmly enough for witnesses, then asked whether I was in town for long, or just making one of my rare appearances. It was such a small sentence that an outsider might have missed the blade in it, but I heard it perfectly. He wanted me placed back where he remembered me. Inconsistent, drifting, slightly embarrassing, someone whose absence had always been evidence rather than consequence. I answered that I was there for the wedding and left it at that. His smile tightened. He was waiting for the old version of me, the one who over-explained, defended herself too quickly, and still believed clarity could purchase kindness. During cocktail hour, I started noticing the little geometry of exclusion that families manage so well. Conversations closed a fraction earlier when I approached. A story about shared vacations continued without anyone acknowledging that I had not been invited. Seating cards placed immediate family close to the center while mine sat further out, not offensively far, just far enough to remind me I was present without being central. That kind of positioning is hard to call out because every detail remains technically defensible. It is not one insult, it is architecture. Danica noticed the seating the same moment I did. She asked quietly if I wanted to stay. I said yes before I could hear the warning in my own voice. There are moments when you can feel a room organizing itself around a humiliation before it happens. You do not know the exact shape yet, but your body does. Mine knew that night, and it was right. The speeches began after the second round of drinks, which is always when people start making choices they later call accidents. My cousin's maid of honor spoke first with the kind of loving nervousness everyone forgives. Then an uncle went too long and cried more than anyone wanted him to. By the time my brother stood with a champagne flute in one hand, the room had settled into that warm, receptive mood that makes an audience easier to steer. He knew exactly how to work a room like that, because he had been performing reliability for years. He opened well, he complimented the couple, landed a small laugh, folded a sentimental memory into a polished observation about commitment, and let people relax into the version of him they preferred. Then his attention shifted toward my table. I felt it before I saw it. He began talking about family, about the people who show up. The people who do the real work. The people who stay close when things become inconvenient. It was vague enough at first to seem harmless, but I knew his method. He liked to build the frame before placing the target inside it. Then he smiled and said that I had been gone 5 years and that the only mystery left was whether I had managed to make anything of myself yet. The laugh that followed was not explosive, but it was large enough to stay in the room. It spread unevenly with the awful little delay that told me people were checking whether it was socially safe to join in. My cousin looked stricken. My mother stared down at her plate. My father did not move. Danica set her glass down with such precision that I knew she was regulating herself one deliberate gesture at a time. I stayed completely still. I did not flush, tighten, or rescue the room by pretending it was funny. That restraint bothered him more than anger would have. People like my brother rely on reaction to confirm scale. If you do not react, they are forced to feel the shape of what they have done without the relief of controlling your response. When the applause came, it sounded thinner than he wanted. He returned to his seat but kept glancing over, waiting to see whether I would leave, cry, or confront him badly enough to make me look unstable. Instead, I sat through the next piece of music, took a sip of water, and let the silence around my table grow more uncomfortable for everyone who had laughed. After a few minutes, he came over under the pretense of smoothing things over. From across the room, it probably looked brotherly. Up close, it was what it had always been. Proximity used as a weapon because it leaves fewer witnesses. He bent down beside me, expensive cologne and champagne hovering in the air, and said I had never belonged in this family. No rage, no slurring, no theatrics, just certainty. That was the cruelest part. He said it like he was naming weather. Something settled long before I arrived and not worth debating. 5 years earlier, that line would have gone through me like glass. That night it landed against something much harder. I reached into my clutch, found the keys by touch, and pressed the fob without breaking eye contact. Across the lot, my black Porsche lit up in the dark beyond the reception hall windows. The headlights flashed first, then the mirrors unfolded. A soft interior glow came alive. It was not loud, but it was impossible to miss. Several people near us turned automatically. My brother looked over his shoulder, then back at me. And for one brief second, his expression emptied in a way I will never forget. He was not impressed. He was disoriented. That mattered more. I said one word, really, nothing else. No list of contracts, no company name, no speech about perseverance. The single word did what a whole argument never could. It told him I was no longer participating in the version of me he had preserved for his own convenience. The people nearest us went still in that peculiar social way people do when a script changes in public and nobody knows what comes next. He recovered fast because men like him are trained to improvise over cracks, but not fast enough to hide the shock entirely. He laughed shortly, adjusted his jacket, and tried to look amused. Yet I had already seen the truth he could not conceal. He had spent 5 years telling himself I was frozen in the role he left me in. Seeing that car did not flatter him, it scared him because if he had been wrong about that, then he might have been wrong about something much larger. A few minutes later, when I stepped outside for air and heard the door open behind me, I knew I was about to find out exactly how much larger. I stepped out into the night because I needed distance from the room, not because I was wounded the way everyone probably assumed. I had moved past visible hurt a long time ago. What I felt instead was older, colder, and far more useful. The sensation of recognizing a pattern I had once escaped and realizing it had never actually ended. The music from inside bled faintly through the walls while I crossed toward the edge of the lot where the air was cooler and the darkness gave everything sharper edges. A minute later, the door opened behind me. My brother did not pretend he was checking on me. He came outside because he wanted the final word the way he always had. He stood a few feet away and said the car was a nice touch. Then he asked in that falsely casual tone people use when they are already exposed what exactly I did these days to afford something like that. I told him I ran a company. He repeated the word company as though naming it with mild skepticism might shrink it back down to something unserious. Then he started talking about responsibility, family obligations, and what he called the real work of staying close when parents get older and practical decisions have to be made. He spoke as though physical proximity automatically translated into moral authority. Then his tone shifted. He said our parents had been making long-term decisions and that I should not act surprised if certain matters no longer included me. I asked him what certain matters meant. He looked out toward the dark rows of the vineyard before answering, which told me he enjoyed the suspense of it. He mentioned the property, the accounts, the planning, all of it in one controlled breath, as if he were granting me a courtesy by admitting what had already been arranged. He said our parents needed people they could trust. He said some of us had proven we were temporary. That word landed harder than the rest. Temporary, disposable in a respectable way, easy to explain away, easy to write around, easy to reduce to a footnote when documents were revised and roles were redistributed. In that moment, I understood that he was not simply insulting me. He was testing the perimeter of what I already knew. I asked whether he was telling me I had been written out. He shrugged with that infuriating calm he wore when he wanted to appear above emotion, and said, "Nobody writes out someone who was never really in." Then he went back inside and left me standing in the parking lot with the kind of silence that changes your posture. I wish I could tell you I followed him back in and confronted everyone then and there, but that is not how these things work when the wound reaches beyond pride into identity. I drove back to the hotel with Danica in the passenger seat saying almost nothing, because she knows how to read the difference between distress and focus. The next morning, I woke with a tightness in my chest that had less to do with insult than with math. Something about the way he had said it did not sound theatrical. It sounded administrative. By noon, that instinct proved right. An email from an advisor's office landed in my inbox because an old family distribution list had never been fully updated. I was not meant to receive it, which made the language feel even more invasive. It referred to trust distributions, revised beneficiary structures, operating authority, and the assumption that management communication should move through my brother going forward. My name appeared only briefly and not as a daughter. It appeared as a complication, a person whose ongoing involvement was unlikely. The email did more damage than the speech ever could have. Public sauvagerie humiliates you in the moment. Administrative eraser tells you the sauvagerie had infrastructure. It tells you the narrative was not emotional and temporary. It was useful. It was being carried into law, property, and future memory. For the next 3 days, I moved through work like someone walking on a badly hidden injury. I missed details I normally would have caught instantly. I answered questions too sharply. I stared at renderings without seeing them. The worst part was not even anger. It was the old temptation to reinterpret the whole thing in the least devastating way possible. Maybe my brother was overstating. Maybe my parents were confused. Maybe nothing had been finalized. Maybe if I stayed calm long enough, the truth would become smaller. Danica watched that rationalization building in me and cut it off cleanly. She closed my office door, sat down across from me, and said, if they were lying about my place in the family, then the first thing I needed to know was what else they were lying about. That sentence shifted everything because it moved the question away from whether I was hurt and toward whether harm had been structured. I had spent too much of my life treating family pain like weather, something to endure rather than investigate. That stopped there. Within 48 hours, I had forwarded every document, every email, and every note I could find to a lawyer. The insult at the wedding was ugly. But by then I understood it had only been surface pressure rising over something much deeper. Once I knew that I no longer wanted reassurance. I wanted records. At first I resisted the full scope of what Danica was suggesting because a part of me still wanted one decent explanation that would make everything smaller than it felt. I told myself families get messy around money, parents panic as they age, older siblings overstep. Paperwork gets interpreted too broadly, and not every ugly pattern is a conspiracy. Danica listened to all of it without interrupting, then asked one question that ended my denial more effectively than any argument could have. She asked whether my brother had ever once in his life overstepped by accident. The answer came so fast, I did not even have time to soften it. Within 2 days, I was sitting across from Miranda Keene, an attorney with the calm face of someone who trusted process more than personality. She reviewed the email and supporting documents with a stillness that made me nervous until she finally looked up and said, "There was not enough yet to prove fraud, but more than enough to justify immediate concern." Through her, I met a forensic accountant and an investigator who specialized in family business disputes, the kind of cases where control gets mistaken for competence until someone finally compares the story to the paper trail. While they started working, I tried to keep my company steady. I apologized to my team for being distracted without explaining why. I delegated more than I wanted to. Then I buried myself in a luxury hotel lounge in Miami that should have been impossible on the timeline we had, and somehow became the thing that kept me from splintering. We were designing a ceiling projection environment for the grand opening, a full immersive visual sequence that would carry guests through changing moods over the course of the evening. The work demanded precision, layering, timing, and trust. And for the first time in days, my mind locked onto something useful. One night after the office emptied, I stayed alone in the studio running test renders across a blank wall. Color moved over concrete. Light stretched and folded. A flat surface became atmosphere. Watching it happen, I felt something in me realign. I had spent years creating environments that made people feel wonder, anticipation, intimacy, and celebration. While back home, I had kept accepting a story in which I was the unstable one. The contrast was almost embarrassing in its clarity. Belonging, I realized, is not proven by gore. It is revealed by where your effort is respected and where your silence is exploited. The preliminary findings came in a week later, and they were bad in the way skilled misconduct usually is, not reckless enough to be obvious at first glance, but patterned enough to become undeniable once someone neutral started tracing it. Money connected to one of the family properties had been routed through a holding company linked to my brother. Maintenance expenses had been inflated beyond the actual work completed. Vendor payments cycled through friendly entities. Revenue from event rentals had been redirected before final distributions were recorded. Some authorization forms bore my parents' signatures, but the timing and language suggested they had not fully understood what authority they were assigning or what future control they were narrowing around him. Then came the emails buried in chains between advisors, managers, and my brother were descriptions of me that made my skin go cold. Not because they were so vague, but because they were strategic. I was described as emotionally detached from the family, financially uninvolved, inconsistently present, and unlikely to challenge major restructuring because I had built a separate life and no longer saw myself as part of the family's long-term future. In other words, he had built a paper version of me that was easier to erase than the real one standing outside his control. Miranda advised me not to react yet. She said, "Men like that survive by staying one step ahead of emotion and one step behind proof." So we kept gathering. I called my cousin under the excuse of checking on her after the wedding and heard enough strain in her pauses to know she had seen more over the years than she had ever been willing to name. I spoke carefully with one of my aunts and learned my brother had gradually positioned himself as the only reliable adult in the room, the one who handled complicated matters so others would not have to worry. Every conversation, every file, every timeline led back to the same center. He had not insulted me because he merely looked down on me. He had insulted me because contempt is useful when you are trying to make theft look like stewardship. The line he had whispered at the wedding began to sound different in my head. It was not just judgment, it was strategy. If he could convince me I had no rightful place, then maybe I would never stand in the place where he could be exposed. Once I understood that, something changed permanently. I stopped wanting an apology. I stopped wanting family clarity or emotional closure or a corrected memory. What I wanted was for the truth to stand in a room large enough that no one could politely look away from it. I wanted the people who had benefited from silence to experience the inconvenience of evidence. Miranda asked whether there was any upcoming event where the right people would be gathered and where records could not easily be dismissed as rumor. I thought about it for less than a second. My father's retirement gala was scheduled for winter at the restored barn venue connected to one of the family properties. A night built around legacy, transition, and everything my brother believed he had already inherited in spirit, if not yet entirely on paper. The moment I said it out loud, the plan stopped feeling hypothetical. It became a timeline. After that, every decision narrowed with purpose. We organized the documents, verified the sequencing, cross-checked figures, prepared clean visual presentations because if there was one thing I understood better than anyone in my family, it was that people see the truth differently when it is impossible to blur at a distance. By the time winter arrived, I was no longer afraid of the room. I was ready for it. By winter, the room had chosen itself. My father's retirement gala was held at the restored barn venue connected to one of the family properties with relatives, old business associates, and longtime family friends gathered to celebrate our family's legacy. My brother moved through the room as if he already owned that legacy, greeting people with practiced warmth and performing reliability so naturally that few ever questioned him. I arrived early with Danica and Miranda because nothing that night was going to be left to chance. Every record had been checked. Every transfer had been organized. Every screen had been tested. I did not want emotion to carry the truth. I wanted facts to do that. Dinner unfolded through praise and polished memories until my brother stood and delivered the kind of speech he always knew how to give. He made control sound like sacrifice and authority sound like service. He thanked my father for trusting him, and the room responded exactly as he expected. Before the applause fully faded, I stood and said that if the evening was truly about legacy, then a few records deserved to be included in that story. He smiled at first, thinking I was about to say something harmless. Then the first document appeared on the screen behind him. The silence in the room changed immediately. There were records tied to a holding company, vendor payments that led in the wrong direction, inflated repair costs, redirected rental income, and forms my parents had signed while being told management only needed to be simplified. Miranda calmly identified each record, and that calm made the truth even heavier. My brother's expression shifted from irritation to disbelief, then into the hard stillness of someone realizing the room no longer belonged to him. He tried to interrupt once, but the effort failed the moment one of the board members asked to see a transfer date again. From that point on, he was no longer the dependable son. He was a man under scrutiny. I stayed near the screen, steady and without anger. This was not about humiliating him. It was about exposing what had been hidden. The email excerpts came last. In them, he described me as emotionally detached, financially uninvolved, and unlikely to challenge major changes because I had built a separate life. Seeing those words in public did not hurt me the way he intended. It clarified everything. He had turned my distance into a tool and tried to use my survival as proof that I could be erased. My mother was the first to speak. She said he had not protected this family. He had protected his control. My father did not defend him. He only asked Miranda whether a full audit could begin immediately. After that, the room changed quickly. Questions came from every direction. My cousin cried quietly. My brother's wife looked at him as if she were seeing him clearly for the first time. What followed was not instant justice, but it was enough. Accounts were frozen. Independent oversight came in. His authority began to collapse. What I felt most was not satisfaction, but relief. Relief that the story attached to my name was no longer the only one being told. Relief that silence had finally stopped protecting the wrong person. If my story means anything, it is this. Exclusion does not always begin with a slammed door. Sometimes it begins with a joke, people excuse, a document no one questions, or a quiet person being told for too long that endurance is the same thing as peace. I used to think belonging was something other people granted. I do not believe that anymore. Belonging begins the moment you stop asking people who benefit from your smallness to tell you who you are. I stopped waiting for my family to define me. And that was the first moment I truly belonged to myself.